Well, good afternoon. I want to wish you a great AUSA Day. My name is George Cohen. I'm part of the AUSA National Headquarters, but you're in for a treat this afternoon. This morning you heard the senior Army leadership at the Congressional Breakfast. You just heard the Chief talk at the Eisenhower Luncheon, and we're finishing off the day with this distinguished panel that's to my left. I want to just reiterate how important this issue is. The Eisenhower Luncheon, the Chief just spoke on a credible deterrence and having the combat capability and capacity to have that credible deterrence. And I think you're going to hear some interesting thoughts today from the panel, and we'll get to that momentarily. So we want to thank you for joining us. The panel is entitled The Year of Execution, Achieving Deterrence in Europe Through Land Power Dominance. As your professional association, the Association United States Army and its Institute of Land Warfare are proud to provide forums like this one throughout the year that broaden the knowledge base of the Army professionals and those who support our Army. These professional development seminars are AUSA's way of amplifying the U.S. Army's narrative to audiences inside the Army and help to further the association's mission to be voice for the Army and support for the soldier. Of course, we cannot do this alone. AUSA relies on its members to help tell the Army story and to support our soldiers and families. A strong membership base is vitally important. Can't stress that. Vitally important to our advocacy efforts in Congress, the Pentagon, the industrial base, as well as to the public in communities across the country through AUSA's 121 local chapters. For those of you, Army professionals, who are not yet members of your professional association, we encourage you to join with a special introductory offer. You will find the invitation on your chair. It looks a little card like this in red. You can bring that card to the AUSA membership booth, which is booth 307 in Exhibit Hall A, or you can go online at ausa.org/membership. And if you're already a member of AUSA, we really thank you for staying with us. Please give your invitation to a fellow professional. You'll be doing a service to the association as well as to the United States Army. Well, that's enough banging on by me. It gives me great pleasure to introduce and turn the floor over to Colonel Kathleen Turner, Public Affairs Director, United States Army, Europe. Colonel Turner.
Thank you, George. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the United States Army Europe team, thank you for coming here today for our panel. A few administrative announcements before we get started. Please turn all cell phones to vibrate so they don't interrupt the panel. Also on your chairs are our Strong Europe placemat, along with a LANDCOM placemat, and hot off the presses, our Strong Europe infograph. Today's panel will be live streamed on U.S. Army Europe's Facebook and Twitter social media platforms. We'll also be tweeting throughout the panel, and I encourage all of you to do the same. We are extremely privileged to have this group of leaders on stage today. Major General Engelbrektson, Swedish Army Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Beulen, Commander of the Royal Netherlands Army, Major General Mika, General Commander of the Polish Army Forces, Lieutenant General Williams, Commander of NATO Allied Command, and last but not least, Lieutenant General Hodges, Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe. And with that, I will turn the mic over to my commander, General Hodges. Sir?
Thank you, Kathy. First thing I do, wake you up after a big lunch, is show you the Strong Europe video.
will be considered an attack against us all.
If you look at USAREUR and what they're doing, they're integral. If you look at just the exercise and the training that they've been doing, the change in tasks, the complexity of those tasks, the distances of the moves they've made in some of the exercises in the Baltics, Romania and Bulgaria, those are all good examples of, one, a change in mindset, a change in the tasks that we have to do, and the change in the way that we go about our training and our readiness.
Prepare for combat means fighting like it's combat. And this kind of training and this challenges and this stress that we placed on the soldiers here, this is as hard as we can make it. You know, our guys haven't slept well, they haven't eaten well, they've been out in 100-degree temperatures, and then they come out and they've performed every single day.
We're partnering with NATO partners and allies as part of a combined arms team to be able to increase the overall return effectiveness.
The National Guard and U.S. Army Reserves are essential for U.S. Army Europe. They train in Europe with our NATO allies and other partners. They build readiness, deter aggression, and improve interoperability.
The participation of U.S. Army Reserve soldiers and National Guard soldiers in our exercises is absolutely critical because that's how we fight. It's all about the total Army, and there are unique capabilities that are essential to U.S. Army Europe being successful in the performance of its mission.
It's important that we are ready, always ready. Readiness means today that we act multinational, together and integrated.
We'll start moving into 4 other countries where we'll begin either our training to sustain our readiness or training with our allied partners.
I think we're going to experience more training and that ability to really show our allies that we're here because it creates alliance. It's reassuring that, hey, we got their backs, they have our backs.
We let them be creative. We let them be tank commanders again. We let them almost choose their own destiny.
It is critically important that our junior leaders be able to work with our allies and our partners to practice their trade, to excel beyond what they consider to be their capabilities, because we challenge them at every turn to be leaders.
So we're teaching squad leaders, section leaders, platoon sergeants, how to work with countries that they wouldn't necessarily maneuver with or fight with on a regular basis.
You know, I'm only a private and I get to do a lot of stuff that, you know, some people who are more higher ranking than me have never done before.
Okay, so if General Milley's speech didn't get you fired up at lunchtime, that video should have certainly got your heart going. I love that damn video. I sit home at night and watch it myself sometimes. Okay, I'm most interested in all of you hearing what these gentlemen to my left have to say, because my number one objective for our panel is to for all of you to realize that the environment in which we are training, which we're operating, which we're deterring in Europe is a multinational environment. The Chief talked about it, the Secretary talked about it, Secretary Mattis talked about it yesterday morning. We don't do anything by ourselves, partly because we don't have the capacity to do anything by ourselves. None of us has the capacity to accomplish missions or defend our own countries alone. So there's a necessity that has all sorts of implications for interoperability and so on that we'll talk about, but also because we've learned over the last 16 years that we are much more effective and stronger when we have allies and or partners with us. So that's my number one message to you today, is that we are in a multinational environment, and what you see here in front of you are very, very good officers who represent that, and that multinationality is the norm. Today, we have an enhanced forward presence battle group, about 800 American soldiers from 2nd Cavalry Regiment that are stationed in Orzic, Poland, northeast Poland, which is America's contribution to the enhanced forward presence concept. They have a British company under them. They have a Romanian air defense battery under them, and we're about to receive Croatian soldiers that will be under them. They are under the 15th Brigade of the Polish Army. That is the norm. In fact, that's the norm across all of Europe. So you can understand the requirement for interoperability of our communications, mission command systems, interoperability of our fires to be able to do digital fire missions in a very nasty, heavily contested EW and cyber environment just a few miles away from Kaliningrad. And also the need to be able to share intelligence. Now, I've spent the last 2 days here walking the floor, looking at all the exhibits, seeing incredible products that the defense industry produces, but I continue to be disappointed that almost everything is made for U.S. only or Five Eyes only, when in fact that's not how we're going to fight. And so we have got to continue to put the demand on industry, but also to get the policies right that allow us to share information and intelligence. Otherwise, you have American soldiers under Polish command that they cannot talk to each other secure. British soldiers under American command, and they cannot talk to each other on the radio secure. We cannot do digital fire missions, and to do counterfire against what we've seen the Russians display in eastern Ukraine requires digital fires to be able to do an effective counterfire mission. Of course, we saw during the Zapad exercise, half of the Latvian cell network was dropped for the duration of the exercise. We've had American soldiers' iPhones getting hacked in northeast Poland. This is the normal environment in which we're operating. So anybody that thinks that we can be successful or effective without secure frequency hopping tactical FM radios, a common operating picture that everybody truly has that common picture, and then the ability to do digital fires, we are taking great risk on our ability to be an effective deterrent. The second point that I want to make is about deterrence. Last summer at the NATO summit in Warsaw, all 28 nations of NATO agreed that we had to make the transition from assurance, which is focused on allies, to deterrence, which is focused on a potential adversary, the Russian Federation. And for deterrence, of course, that means you have to have capability, you have to demonstrate that capability, and you have to demonstrate the will to use that capability. Critical part of that is speed. We have to be able to move as fast or faster than Russian Federation forces if we want to prevent a crisis from happening somewhere in Eastern Europe. The unity of the alliance, the unity of the European Union, all of us sticking together is a critical part of that, but we have to be able to move. Otherwise, Russian Federation could make a terrible miscalculation that they might be able to peel off 1, 2, or 3 countries from NATO before we could react. I believe that we have about 7 days. So that means we have to be able to get an Armored Brigade combat team formed up, massed somewhere along the eastern flank of NATO inside of 7 days. And that will have to happen in peacetime conditions, because our political leaders correctly are going to want to avoid anything that looks like a provocation or escalation. So that means all of the EU road laws remain in effect. Everything will be done in peacetime conditions. We will be competing for access to rail. So given those conditions, we are still going to have to be able to get an Armored Brigade combat team or the entire 2nd Cavalry Regiment somewhere in northeast Poland, Romania, depending on wherever the crisis might be happening, inside of 7 days. So this speed of assembly is a critical part of our deterrence. The other part, though, of course, is the rotational forces that the United States committed to under the previous administration. A rotational, heel-to-toe, 9-month rotations, Armored Brigade combat team. We started off with 3rd Brigade of the 4th Division out of Fort Carson. A rotational combat aviation brigade, 10th Combat Aviation Brigade. Colonel Claire Gill and his leaders are here, by the way. Hope you'll grab them after this, so that we have a full combat aviation brigade back on the continent of Europe again, but those are 9-month rotations. So it gives us the chance to practice deployments. We learned a lot from the first deployment with 3-4, and then you just saw Dave Gardner, 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division on the video. We learned so much from that first deployment, fixed, I would say, most of the things in the second deployment that came into Gdansk. Of course, we had to discover a couple new problems to solve, but that's the Army. We're a learning institution, and of course, we're not doing it by ourselves. Transcom helped us fight through 2 hurricanes to deliver 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division on time into Gdansk. The last point I want to make here, and then I will certainly look forward to questions afterwards. I'm happy to talk about anything that's of interest to you. The exercise Zapad that was just concluded. There was a lot of attention on Zapad. Zapad is a Russian word, means west. Every 4 years, the Russians have their major exercise in the Western Military District. And I think what we saw was a great example of their attempts to create a false narrative, to mislead as to what they're really doing. They had most people thinking that Zapad was just in Belarus and that there will only be 12,700 soldiers involved in it. Miraculously, every Russian exercise has only 12,700 soldiers in it, just below the 13,000 threshold for where you have to invite observers and declare the exercise. So I don't know how many soldiers are having in any exercise any day. Somehow they have exactly 12,700 every single time. So the narrative that they've attempted to put out there is that really, see, we were very transparent and we're just interested. Meanwhile, there were tens of thousands of Russian soldiers all over the Western Military District, north of the Arctic Circle, and in the Southern Military District, in a series of connected exercises that we paid a lot of attention to. My three big takeaways from Zapad: best intelligence cooperation sharing that I've ever seen. All kinds of walls came down across the alliance, between the nations. It's not perfect, but it's better than I have ever seen. And of course, we've got to maintain that, not surge it for an exercise. We have got to maintain that level of intelligence sharing. My second takeaway was confidence in the Enhanced Forward Presence, EFP battle group concept. Our alliance, in less than a year, 11 months from the strategic decision at Warsaw to establish multinational enhanced forward presence battle groups, each of which has to be capable of defeating a Russian brigade, all of them were fielded in less than a year in Estonia, led by the UK, and Latvia, led by Canada, and we have the EFP battle group from Canada, by the way. Wade, where are you? I know I saw you a little bit earlier, back in the back there. Germany. And by the way, so good to have Canada back on the continent of Europe. That was essential. Germany is the lead nation for the EFP battle group in Lithuania, the first nation to actually get their battle group put in place. Very important and good example of German leadership in Europe. And then finally, the United States and Poland, all of these multinational formations. Third takeaway is I think that nobody believes anything that the Russians say anymore. Their attempt to hide behind this 12,700 when everybody in Europe knew there were more than 12,700 troops. So when you compare the transparency of Western exercises where we have journalists all over us watching everything we do, we invite them there, whereas the lack of transparency for a Russian exercise, that's what creates anxiety. That's what makes people worried about what the exercise is all about. With that, I look forward to hearing now from General Karl Engelbrektson, a great soldier. Karl.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for having the opportunity from a nice country like Sweden to come to this good weather. We always like this weather in the winter time. I would like to start off with having a broader perspective from a Swedish point of view, starting with the fact that we now live in a place where everything is connected to everything. That in combination with an economy that is based on lean production and on-the-move storage. So we are very vulnerable, but on the other hand, we are all interconnected. That's the good news. But it doesn't really matter if the flow of global goods is interrupted in the Malacca Strait or in the Bay of Aden. For us living up in the Nordic part of Europe, if the goods does not come to Gothenburg Harbor, it will not end up in any other Baltic states either, because that's a big logistic hub up north. And that is, of course, the same fact for Russia. Russia has half of its economy with Europe through the Baltic Sea, either under in the pipes or at the ships. At any given time in the Baltic Sea, there are around 4,000 ships sailing. Hence, if you want to disturb the flow of goods in the Baltic Sea or the global flow of goods, you can do that. And for us, therefore, we see similarities with the former Crimean War, where also the interest of the region of the Baltic Sea and the Nordic countries were increased. At that time, that was in the mid-1860s, the Allies also sailed into the Baltic Sea. At that time, it was only France and the UK. And by the way, they anchored on the island of Gotland and had the purpose to open up a new flank to Russia. Today, when there is a war at the Crimea, the whole NATO is coming into the Baltic Sea, and the shores of the Baltic states are again in focus. and of course the whole Nordic region are in focus. So today we see increased military activity, increased military presence, and of course increased military exercises going on. And by the way, we are, for instance, re-establishing troops and military presence and building a new regiment on the island of Gotland again. For me personally, that is really something, because I was the last commander of the island of Gotland and had to close that down, and now it's my task to build it up again. And that was only in 2004. So the presence is actually felt back home. But before I go into more of that, let's have some short facts about Sweden. Sweden is not Switzerland. It's another nice country in Europe. I'm not personally able to maybe depict more than 20 states and put it on the right place in US. So I gather most of you cannot put the right countries on the right place in Europe either. So that's okay. But Sweden is up north, neighboring Norway and Finland. We are not a neutral country. We are a military non-allied country. It means we are not members of NATO. But we have very close partnership with NATO, and we are one of 5 countries, for instance, together with Finland, that have the enhanced opportunity partnership status. So we adhere to all the interoperable principles of how to do military business according to the NATO OCC standards. Because NATO language is the only language for us if we do operations together. More facts about Sweden is that we are regaining what we called the total defense concept, including all the civilian agencies and military industry. And we also come from a proud history of having a high industrial base and a good military defense capability. So we do business together with industry, and many of them are represented here. So for instance, in relation to the US, you can maybe know about the Carl Gustaf, the 84, the Excaliburs, the Giraffe systems, and so forth. And that's Swedish. So we are proud of having a good, strong military capability in our own country. On top of the total defense concept, partnerships and bilateral relationships is at the core of the Swedish defense policy. In that spirit, the Secretary of State of the US and the Minister of Defense in Sweden has signed an SOI, a statement of intent, where we should increase our military-to-military cooperation. And in that spirit, we have now put that down to army level and doing practical things on the tactical level. Achieving deterrence by land power dominance in Europe was the title. As a starter, as always, it starts with leadership, and I would like to actually congratulate and put Ben in front of that. Because you are a force multiplier, Ben. Not only are your task to have 30,000 to look like 300,000, but you actually act that way. Everybody knows in my country who General Ben Hodges is. And they are proud to know him and proud to do business with him. And that helps me. And I would like to put that in the forefront because it helps me actually, a 2-star general from a small country like Sweden, to be underpinned and politically enabled to go and do business with your country. And that's in the end starting with you, Ben. I will come back a little bit to that later. But anyway, what do we have to do in order to achieve land power dominance? Well, we have to have land power. It's time to rebuild some of the military capabilities in the armies. And to do that in a credible way, because our adversary knows what is military credible. They are good. And they know if we have the capability or not. We cannot cheat. We have to show that, and we have to show excellence while we exercise. That's why we had the Aurora exercise hosted in Sweden, and we had 20,000 troops exercising in Sweden, with a lot of countries. The major troop participating country above Sweden was US, but it was also Norway, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and of course Finland, our greatest bilateral partner. That's a big exercise, and we exercised host nation support. That actually means that on the one hand you need to be able to host. That means logistics and headquarters and knowledge. On the other hand, you need to have the capability to support. So we need to build up the forces not only to defend ourselves, but in order to be able also to have capabilities to send to others. Otherwise, of course, partnerships is not working. We need to have some extra so we can help our friends. So we need to build up that. We do that in producing, again, brigade combat teams, real brigades with maneuver warfighting capabilities, including all the functions like ground-based air defense, artillery, engineers, and so forth, and logistics in a maneuverable concept. That we are training again, and we are at a good start. I think also we need to be more focused when it comes to interoperability, because by definition, interoperability in land power in Europe has to be international. Hence, we need to have interoperability. But I think sometimes we overdo the interoperability in defining too much. If we instead, because as General Milley said, we don't have time, we need to define the requirements that really drives evolution and development and warfighting capability. So for instance, if we focus on digital joint fires, we will come to the conclusion that we need a common recognized air picture, we need procedures, we need this and that. But if we can answer, are you able to do digital joint fires? And the answer is yes, then we have a lot of other requirements at place, not starting to define everything, but what we need to do. Furthermore, I think we need to do more on our exercises, maybe not have more exercises, but to have more out of our exercises. And being able to strategically communicate what we are actually doing. There we can learn from the Russians. They are good at strategic communication, and we need, and we, because we do exercise a lot, I usually use the NASCAR symbol. It's the same race, but all the cars has a lot of stickers, and if you want to put a new sticker on, it's the same race. And I think we can put bilateral stickers, Nordic stickers, European stickers, US, Europe stickers on the exercises and strategically communicate them so that everybody knows that we are on the same side, because it's a lot of activities going on. The bad news is actually we need to do more. The good news is we have the leadership, the trust and the people and the skills to do more. And I stop there. Thank you.
Leo.
Ladies and gentlemen, especially Ben, thank you very much for having me here with such a distinguished audience to be in this panel. In 10 minutes, I just can touch upon a few topics, but I'm happy to discuss any question afterwards, to go into depth if necessary. And I also want to stress, because the title is Achieving Deterrence in Europe Through Land Power Dominance, but you have to be very careful because we just need our joint and combined interagency allies to do this. Only land will not deliver this at all. There's a small wisdom, that is that it is easy to predict the future, especially if it's behind you. So you have to look into the decisions we made a few years ago with the knowledge we had then. I take you back to 2010 to the NATO summit, where Russia was more or less a friend. We're going to do stability operations together, and we could get rid of all our heavy equipment. And that's only 7 years ago. 4 years later, in 2014 at the summit in Wales, the world looked completely different. Russia annexed the Crimea, and especially for the Netherlands, the downing of the MH17, a civilian airliner that killed 300 people and 200 Dutch, made our population very clear that the world had changed. If you combine that to the situation in the Middle East, instability in Northern Africa, and not to forget the threat of terrorism in mainland Europe, then you see we have a whole different situation in our hands. And I think our public also realized that, I'll come back to that later, because just today we announced a new government with a new budget, and things are going well. In that light, it's not a surprise that the last 20 years we have especially experienced instability operations. We did it in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Mali, and not only there, because it's very strange for a European country that our border to Venezuela in South America is only 50 kilometers away. Because we have still some parts of our kingdom in the Caribbean, like Curacao, Aruba, and also Sint Maarten. So we also have forces deployed in Sint Maarten to help out civil government after the disaster of the Hurricane Irma. If you look at these missions, or rotational missions, 5 rotational missions, we need a battalion per mission. They have our standby task for the NATO Quick Reaction Force and the EU Battle Group, which is also a reaction force, and the German Netherlands headquarters, which is on standby for joint headquarters. That means that literally all our forces are now involved in stability operations. And we just already heard, and I fully agree on that we have to refocus our focus to high-intensity conflict. But the last 20 years, if you only deploy and only train for stability operations, somewhere along the line, you're also prepared for that. And somewhere along the line, reinforced by budget cuts, you cut in spare parts, you cut in logistics, you even cut in weapon systems. And that's what we really have to restore. And don't get me wrong, because for a platoon that walks a patrol in Afghanistan, that walks into an ambush, is just all-out war. Nothing else than all-out war. But that's completely different than doing combined arms operations on brigade and division level. And that's something we really have to be good at again. And that's coordination of maneuver and air power, firepower. It's mobility and counter mobility. It's integration of air defense. And just to give one example, people are just used to having air superiority from the beginning in the operations we do now. That's something you will not have if we fight a near-peer competitor, not at all. So you have to use to get to do that again. It's about space and time and about force. And it's about speed of decision making. If I take a terrorist out, I can do it this week or next week. If a division attacks me, I have to do it right now. There's no tomorrow, because then I lost that fight. So we have to restore our fighting capabilities. And it's not only the physical component, but we just said we have to combine, we have to restore the balance between combat service support, and combat support. We have to restore the supplies, but that's only the physical component. We also have to look at the conceptual component, because we have to teach back the skills and capabilities that we needed to do the high-intensity fight. And I dare say that that's only, let's say, in a generation of my age and 10 years younger. We have only a few years to bring that back in the force. But it's not good to teach what we did 20 years ago, not only what we taught 20 years ago. The world also in fighting has dramatically changed, only to mention cyber warfare and a complete new logistic concept. So we have to really develop a way of warfare. And also, already mentioned, and I want to emphasize that, for a country like ours and a force like that we have, international cooperation is just in our genes. It's necessary, we cannot do without it. And it's not like we used to do in the good old days when we defended Europe against the Warsaw Pact, that every national corps had its own area operations, which was almost a national operation together. Now we integrate on a much lower level. Our main partner that we work together with is Germany. We have a combined corps headquarters already since 1995. We started the 2 of us. Now there are 10 other countries involved, and many of them are here in the room. And I think that's working very well. We even went so far that we put 2 brigades under operational command of German divisions. And it goes so far that a German tank battalion has a Dutch tank company working in a Dutch brigade. So that goes to quite a low level. On the other hand, quite recently, German air defense units were put under command of a Dutch air defense unit. So that means that integration is going quite a long way. And it's not only about training, it's also about deploying together, because all the operations I just mentioned, almost all of them, we do together with Germany. Not only not in the Caribbean, but I think Germany will be quite interested to send some soldiers over there for a few months, and we may take care of that. It's not only Germany that we work together with. All other European countries, like Norway, like France, like Britain, like the Benelux, are close partners for the Netherlands. And just to mention a few examples for the people here on the table. First of all, of course, the US. The US is the main supporter of almost any country in Europe, especially for the Netherlands, in everything we do. Just to mention one example is that we use the Hohenfels training area, a very modern and sophisticated training area in the southern part of Germany. And right today, our Air Assault Brigade is doing a big maneuver over there. With Sweden, we are a common user of the CV-90. There's a very modern infantry fighting vehicle. And we founded a user group to have better connections to industry to make that smoother. And, for example, for Poland, which you still will never forget, their role they played in the liberation of the Netherlands in the Second World War. But we also work very closely together now, because the big exercises we do, like the 2015 NATO exercise for the VJTF, and our latest mechanized brigade exercises we normally do in the big terrains in Poland. Thank you very much for that. Working together means that we have to be interoperable, and General Engelbrektson mentioned that already. And we have to work on that specifically. Just to give you an example how that can work is that now we are planning to build Dutch radios in the German tanks, so the coordination between that battalion and the Dutch brigade can work. That goes so far, and that's a very concrete example. But it's also there, not only the physical part that you have to look at, it's also here that we have to look at the conceptual part, because we have to synchronize our doctrine on a tactical and operational level, that we understand each other when we go to war together. And in that area, it's not only working together means, and I just mentioned a few examples, it's about personal relationships. And therefore also this meeting is quite interesting, because here you meet the other people. It's better to talk to each other before you need each other. Innovation, that's the third I that I always use. Next to international interoperability is innovation. If we do not innovate, we're obsolete within a few years. Only mention cyber warfare and everything that's going around in military development. And we have not only to innovate our technical capabilities, we also have to innovate, and also General Milley mentioned that, the way we procure, the way we organize. That is going to change dramatically in the next 10 years, and that's necessary to keep up to speed. To achieve deterrence in Europe through land power dominance, we only achieve that by having the capabilities in one place, and second is to show the absolute will to use them. We have to restore these capabilities, and it's good to know that our government today raised our budget with more than almost 20% for the coming years, and that's a good step forward. To show the will, to give you a good example, that is in 2015, the NATO Very High Readiness Force was introduced, and the Netherlands, Germany and Norway were the first to work together under the 1st German-Netherlands Corps to step up and fill that task in. And we did that by a demonstration exercise in 2015 in Poland. But not only in 2015, we have the same package of countries in 2019 and again in 2023. Because if you work with the same package, you can really work on interoperability, and you have the solutions ready for the next time. That will really help us out. Already mentioned by General Hodges is the enhanced forward presence, where 4 nations take the lead and we participate in the German battalion for the next years to come. And we are very grateful that the US is sending their troops back to Europe. A brigade already, 2 brigades, and the plans are to make that even a division. And that's really and trusting for the countries in Europe. You do that also by deploying your materiel in the army pre-position stocks. One of them is positioned in the southern part of the Netherlands, and we are very happy to help you in any way you can to maintain that storage. But that's not only the one division. If we really have to go to war, we will certainly work with follow-on forces. They have to come from over the ocean to Europe. And we used to be very good at that some 20 years ago in the Cold War. All the plans were ready in detail. These plans are gone, the flat wagons are gone, and all the coordinating measures are gone. And we have to restore them quickly, because you can't imagine, even with a almost unified Europe, you might say, how difficult it is to get things over the border. And we have to speed that up, especially in peacetime, because we have to make speed. But I'm pretty much confident that we are able to change that quite quickly, because in the end, it's about credible deterrence based on assured capabilities and conviction that we will use it when necessary. And I just want to conclude with a remark that my colleague General van Loon always mentioned, and I think it's so good that I mention it here also. He said, if the guard dog of your neighbors looks like a poodle, you may consider to step over the fence. If it looks like a Doberman, you will think twice. I'd rather be that Doberman than a poodle. Thank you very much.
Okay. Dear General Hodges, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished visitors, all distinguished guests. It is my big pleasure and honor to be here with so outstanding soldiers, a representative of industry, media, distinguished visitors. I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you very much, General Hodges, to do it. I see it as a great honor for me personally and recognition of the achievements of Polish armed forces. The Russian aggression on Ukraine in 2014 has changed the political military situation in Eastern Europe completely. It has also changed the view of many countries of their policy, including Poland. Since the Cold War had ended, the European countries' defense spending was systematically lowered. Today, in face of Russian aggressive politics, we know that it was a wrong choice. Poland increases its defense budget every year. Currently, it is 2% of GDP. We plan to reach 2.5% of GDP in 2030. In 2018, it will give us 10% more money than we have in 2017. We are very determined to develop our defense capabilities by technical modernization and enlargement of our forces. We focused on to fill our NATO summit agreements. We built the territorial defense forces, which is completely new service for us. The Polish armed forces are expected to increase members of military personnel. The cooperation with our allies has also a huge influence on the development of Polish armed forces. Since 2014, the number of foreign troops in Poland increased several times. Now we know each other. I would like to say that the level of cooperation is marked by the huge number of exercises we had in the last years were increased totally. In 2018, we will host Saber Strike 18 exercise and Swift Response 18 with great number of soldiers. We are taking a big advantage from the permanent presence in Poland of NATO, especially ABCT, EFP forces and US forces, as well other NATO forces presence. It helps us to create professional armed forces but also to improve our capability as a host nation, which is extremely important for a NATO operation against any aggression on a Polish Europe territory. We learned a lot during combined exercise and trainings. It was a very vital period of time for Poland, for Polish armed forces. We know that operational interoperability is a key, but we need interoperability in all aspects we cooperate. For example, as a host nation, we focused a huge problem with different standards for training among allies, different instructions, different procedure, and differently constrained training facilities. We all took huge effort to altitude the impact of these differences in combined training. So extensive combined exercise led us to the conclusion that we have to extend interoperability much beyond the military, because war is not the exclusive domain of the military. It applies, among the others, to infrastructure, country law, and regulation, etc. For example, in my opinion, as much we can facilitate the movement of allied forces through Poland, the more defendable we are. Poland appreciates the benefits of common defense. That's why we are very active in this matter. We have troops in Latvia as a part of the EFP battle group, the same in Romania as a part of the EFP battle group too. Our F-16 fighters protect Baltic states' airspace. We also deployed our troops to Afghanistan, Kosovo, Kuwait, Iraq, Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Polish military has always been where it has been needed. The strong relationship we built between us make us confident of our allies. We have to remember plans, concepts, policies, cooperation, training, and other activities shape the geostrategic security environment. Effective overall training activities, deterrence, must show that forces can credibly and legitimately operate in different domains, demonstrating their capabilities. This is very important. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I'd like to thank AUSA and to Ben Hodges as well for allowing me to speak on this panel. Command Sergeant Major Lyon, Kai Roschneider, thanks very much for everything you do for LANDCOM. My team, Sergeant Major, stand up back there. I got a Canadian Sergeant Major, Steve Rice. I've got a 3-star DCOM, Deputy Commander, a Chief, Turkish 2-star, and a Bulgarian, Hungarian, Spanish 1-stars that support me in Izmir, about 350 strong. Most of the Americans that rotate every year, I have to convince them that they're in NATO as they come in a year at a time. All the other nations are there for a little bit more than that. My boss, General Scamparati with the NATO hat, has 5 strategic challenges. First, as Ben talked about, assurance to deterrence, very key. We've done a lot of things. Many of the people in the room are involved with that. Secondly, the alliance unity, as you can see represented up here on the stage. And then his 3 hours, Russians, radicals, and relevance is what his strategic challenges and opportunities are in NATO. I'd like to put you on the chart here. I've got my green takeaway. Ben Hodges taught me how to do this. I've learned from him. You know, Ben started LANDCOM a few years ago, so I'm still learning. 3 takeaways on that slide. You see my patch in the middle. It's there purposely to show the connectivity to the other pieces that are moving around the constellation. The NATO command structure in the top right-hand corner, you see General Scamparati, General Farina, myself, General Walters, Admiral Johnstone, and Admiral Howard make up command structure. NATO is in the process of going through adaptation, where they're trying to figure out what is the right line Most of us currently are not fit for purpose. So what should command structure do, and what should force structure do? The other teammates you see on the chart there, the 9 corps commanders, and then MND Southeast from Romania on the chart, make up, along with the flags on the top represented on the stage, the NATO force structure. So command structure and force structure, NATO has taken a real hard look at what the roles and responsibilities are as we go forward, and I'll talk more about it. If you look at the top left-hand corner, that's our mission. Everything before the semicolon takes up about 80% of our time. We're about a lot of the things that the gentlemen have talked about, standards, interoperability, everything they talked about is sort of my homework list to get after, back up through NATO. How do we do interoperability? How do 6 teams at the battle group level, 6 countries represented at the battle group and below, talk and shoot fire missions, all the things that Ben posited earlier and the other chiefs talked about. And then after the semicolon is our mission, to conduct land operations as a land component command. That's currently our mission. I anticipate with this adaptation look at changing here, adapting in the near future. You can see on all my teammates there, U.S. soldiers are integrated in those corps. If you look underneath, I've got the numbers broken out. Not only in my headquarters in Izmir, but in all those corps and at Echelon on the page there. But really the strength, I think the power and diversity of NATO. I have 23 of the 29 nations represented, along with 4 partners that live in Izmir. If you could turn it over, the top left-hand corner, that's our current big exercise. You heard many of the chiefs talk about we need to get back to basics. Major Joint Operation Plus. Think of conventional war. That's where General Scaparrotti is pushing. He's assuming risk at the left end of the continuum with the projecting stability piece and focused on blocking and tackling, as Karl and Leon and others talked about when they spoke. Readiness, readiness, readiness. It fits very neatly with our chief, U.S. Army chief's mode. So this, if I drew this left-hand quadrant here in a year or two, it would look very differently, because we would do 3 of these, not take 18 months to do 1 of these. We would do 3 of these in a year. So 3 major joint operation exercises starting in 19. Trident Jupiter 1 and 2, focused on the response force, and then the Loyal Leader exercise focused on corps, and a LiveX. So 3 of these and a LiveX starting in 19, a forcing function to increase readiness in NATO. That's General Scaparrotti's vision. If you look over in the second quadrant, top quadrant, Ben and the others have talked about that. That shows the span of the enhanced forward presence. LANDCOM's tasks are the ones I have eliminated there. I'm trying to pull together. I've got teams embedded with the contributing nations and host nations that are going around in a collection mode to provide the next iterations of battle groups a handbook. That's a practical way. We also held a very large rock drill last spring with all the framework nations, sending nations, contributing nations to get at visualizing this space that you see depicted there. You know, Wade Rutland, who is in the great country of Latvia, with his 6 countries trying to integrate that, that's tough stuff. And Ben laid out, and others laid out, the challenges associated with that. The bottom left-hand corner, probably the second big initiative in NATO beyond the enhanced forward presence, is this idea of a hub. You know, the enemy is all about where you sit, and many of our great countries to the south, their challenge, their mission sets about migration and potential mission sets of that ilk. And so JFC Naples, Admiral Howard, has control of NATO Strategic Direction South, the hub. If you have questions about that, I can talk about that more. Those are the 2 big NATO efforts there. And then the bottom right-hand corner, our away games in LANDCOM, all about projecting stability on the upward movement. You can see from now in 17 the increased number of activities. That's including across the pond there, the Mediterranean, into MENA, Middle East and North Africa. We are extending, NATO's extending its reach beyond just Europe proper. So those are the things that we're doing in LANDCOM. We are very much a support team. The great thing about being in Izmir and working with my great allies here is that, and with Ben, is that Ben told me a long time, he goes, look, Darryl, we do, everything I do is allied and joined in nature, so you just need to come and validate the thing. And whether it's swift response, allied spirit, dynamic front, and all the exercises the gentleman talked about, they are NATO and joint and allied by form and function. And our job is to go and make sure that we are increasing the interoperability and standardization pieces. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General Williams. Thank you to all the gentlemen for your comments. We are now going to go to our Q&A portion. We've got about 45 minutes or so for questions. You'll notice there's microphones in the aisles, so I ask if you have a question, please come up to the microphone, state your name and your agency that you represent, and then you can direct your question to a particular gentleman or have all five answer that question. I'm going to kick it off with the first question, if that's okay, because I think some people are going to be shy to come up to the microphones first. I'm going to direct this to Lieutenant General Beulen. And Zapad was mentioned a few times from the panel, and I'd like to ask, sir, how has Zapad affected your perception of the threat, sir? How has Zapad affected your perception of the threat, of the Russian threat, sir?
Oh, the exercise?
Yes, sir.
It's interesting to see just what Ben already mentioned, that you have such a big exercise with 12,700 soldiers, which is hard to understand. Therefore, we didn't have any observers with them. I was able to speak to some other people in other exercises who had access to, let's say, information that we cannot share with everybody. And their impression was that it was really an exercise and not a build-up for something else. So therefore, that didn't make me very nervous, but we still have to have a keen eye on what is going on.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Does any other gentleman want to answer that question or their perception, sir?
One of the things that we're taking away from the Zapad exercise is that this is the next iteration of, I think, the Russians trying to get everybody accustomed to really large formations and large exercises happening right on the border. So you become almost numb to it. I was talking to a senior Estonian officer the other day, and he said, you know, just a few years ago, the Russians would broadcast everything when they had just an airplane that might have gone 4 to 6 hours on a surveillance mission out over the Baltic or over the North Atlantic. Now you've got thousands of troops exercising, doing all kinds of things, and they don't even talk about it. So it's part of trying to numb everybody so that you get accustomed to that. Now that absolutely does not mean that therefore they're preparing a Trojan horse or something like that. The point is, we have to pay attention. I am sure, and of course, my friends here all live much closer, their countries have lived closer to Russia for centuries, but I am sure that they only respect strength and they despise weakness, and so we have to have our eyes wide open. One of the aspects of deterrence, we call it speed of recognition. How fast can we identify what's happening? And it won't be like what Lieutenant Hodges thought it was going to be in 1981, long columns of Russian tanks waiting to cross the border. It's going to be something that by design is much more difficult to see, to create that ambiguity, which of course then kind of pulls at the unity of the alliance and affects our decision making. So speed of recognition is what's so important. We're lucky to have Colonel Devin Blake, the commander of 66 MI Brigade. She's in here, and I hope you'll seek her out after this. The work that she and the other intelligence professionals have done to be able to understand what it is that the Russians are doing.
Just to say that at the same time the Zapad was the time when we had our 20,000 troops Aurora exercise. And if I'm not mistaken, that was a rather big exercise in Poland at the same time as well.
Yes.
So from that, I just want to exemplify what I said briefly in my introduction. if we are better to communicate that we actually are exercising at the same time, and we can make much more of that in Stratcom, but also when it comes to the higher echelons of exercise objectives for higher staffs. So we can get more out of what's already ongoing. Another takeaway from the SAPAD, our view is like yours. But usually when we have big exercises, we need to have special training in information operations. We didn't have any play in information operations during exercise Aurora. We deal with real-life information operations because it was a lot ongoing on both our exercise and the SAPAD exercise, and everything was not true. So it was really good to have the opportunity to exercise real life on this exercise. And practically we took away all the cell phones. So General Nash troops from Minnesota that were there, they were operating without their cell phones. We took them away and shot them down because we need to train not to show emissions. And that was thanks to SAPAD.
Sir, any question?
Visa icebreaker. Christoph von Marschall from Germany. I have two questions, one to General Lieutenant Beulen from the Netherlands and one maybe to all of you. So did I understood that correctly, that if there were a major conflict in Europe, you would still think that we would need to bring US troops into Europe because what we have in Europe is not enough to defend ourselves? And you said 20 years ago there were still all these plans in operation. You mean 20 or 30 years ago? Because 20 years ago is 97. That was after the big removal of US troops, and the Cold War is almost 30 years away. And the general question is, if the Russians are behaving in that way, as you describe, I mean, what does that tell us? Does they don't take us serious? If I look at the economic weight of the European Union or the United States, any real conflict might seem foolish to start with, because European Union has a GDP which is 6 times the GDP of Russia. The US has another 5 times the GDP of 6 times the GDP of Russia. Why would a country like Russia, which has maybe 3.5% of global GDP, risk a real conflict with an alliance or a coalition of countries which have 45% of GDP of the world, are technically very advanced? And if they are nevertheless doing it or trying it or showing as if they were the Doberman and not the poodle, then what has this to do with how we present ourselves to them?
Let me first answer the first question you asked me, whether we have enough forces or whether we need the forces from, let's say, the other side of the ocean. It's also to do with the reaction time. How fast can we react, and how fast are we able to react to something that happens on the other side? And if you then see what we have on very short notice available, it's a very reassuring idea that the US and Canada might help us if necessary. That is also to do with the answer to your second question afterwards. Then, if I remember well, 1989, the wall fell, and 92, there were still Russian forces in former Eastern Germany. We don't throw our plans immediately, so we still had them till 97. We still had the flat wagons till 97, but then we got rid of them because we saw things changing. That's why I mentioned 20 years. So if we dig back in the archives, I'm not sure whether you still have them, but I'm pretty much sure that we can find them again.
Just to make... Is it on? Yeah. A lot of the answers was already put in your question. Because, of course, in the long run, the share economy of the West will, of course, win. But we want to avoid that to happen in the first place. And Europe, and I think that is what it's about. It's, of course, above the level of a chief of army in Sweden to speculate on, but I think we are all in this together, and it's about the Western way of defining our lives. If we want to have nations to be able to choose their own way of how they would like to define the security policy and defense policy, we need to be able to defend that. And if you go to Ukraine, I think they they have experienced. And they experienced what Russia said already when they were in Georgia. So by provoking conflict, it's according to the European Union and also the NATO expansion rules, so to speak. They have a conflict and it will not happen. And there we are. And I think that is really serious. That is how we mostly see why we need to build up and not downsize our forces, but build them up again and together with others. And also, I think we come from a history that strength is what the other side respects. And then we need to show what we are able to do in a balanced way, like we did now in the exercise Aurora and the Polish exercise together with Zapad. It was deconflicted, but I think it showed what we are capable of doing, unfortunately.
Go ahead, Darryl.
Yeah, thanks, man. The other piece to that, there are forces, very, very high capable forces in NATO available. We have plans. I mean, a lot of it I can't talk about in this venue here, but there are plans, graduate response plans to get after that. There are high readiness forces ready to go. To get at your question of whether, you know, there are European nations there that are ready to answer. There's a core standing by right now, ready to go, along with other elements that are ready to go to respond. So I talked a little about EFP, others talked about the enhanced foreign presence, but the NATO force integration units, 40 big L&O teams ready to bring on forces from all these great countries. All of that in the aggregate, all the things that were mentioned by Ben and others, makes up our deterrent effect and provides ready forces ready to respond.
Say, and I don't think anybody thinks a Russian attack of some sort is imminent or even likely. Obviously, we want to keep it unlikely by having this strong deterrence that we heard General Milley talk about earlier. I was completely wrong about Crimea. I never envisioned they would do that. I didn't envision they would go into Georgia. I didn't envision they would go into the Donbass. So I wouldn't apply Western logic to anything that the Russians are doing either. We absolutely want to keep the door open. I think the world wants Russia back into the international community. We have a lot of areas of common concern and interest. And finally, we need German leadership. I mean, Germany is such an important nation, not just in Europe, but in the world. Germany has earned a level of moral credibility and leadership that is respected all around the world. So Germany, not just an economic power, but a moral leader. The leadership of the Germans in keeping the EU sanctions on Russia. I mean, that's essential. Without German leadership, none of that happens. And without sanctions, then I think the whole thing starts to come apart and keeping the pressure on the Russians.
Can we have someone's been very patient back there with the question?
Captain 101st Standard Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. In 2007, at the St. Petersburg Economic Conference, Vladimir Putin came out and said that U.S. or Russian forces in the Russian economy cannot match NATO forces in the NATO economy, and that they would have to use asymmetric warfare to counter what he saw as NATO threats and aggression. And then in 2014, they did just that with when they followed the Gerasimov doctrine in Ukraine, which essentially using information warfare, special operations forces to go through and exploit cultural differences within Ukraine to create a civil war within that country. I believe that for the next 10 years, we're not going to see a force-on-force fight with Russia. What we're going to see is asymmetric warfare with Russia, where they're using cultural differences, whether that's in Lithuania with the ethnic Russians or whether that's in Spain with the Catalonians. So how does NATO fight Russia asymmetrically whenever it's really not quote-unquote Russians that we're fighting, it's ethnic Russians wanting to create their own state?
So you want to take that first?
I think General Engelbrektson has a great answer.
I don't know that, but well, since the title of the seminar
is actually to have deterrence by land power dominance, I think we need to be able to do several things at the same time. One, not only going for the asymmetric focus. We need to be able to do that. And I know that you have just delivered a new doctrine. We need to be able to do all the 5 phases. Because if we focus only on this gray area of the battle, we risk to forget the capabilities that we now need to regain. I give you a short example. If we create a vacuum, if we are weak, we create an opportunity for the enemy. But if we at the same time have powerful land forces, and this is my personal statement, I think land forces is about existential threat. So if you want to take a part of another country, you need to bring along land forces in order to protect your gains, in order to, over a long period of time, be able to support your own units for whatever reason you would like to have this piece of territory. So the conclusion of that is, if we all have at least what we call, and the Finns have kept that for a long time, a minimum credible requirement of military capabilities, regardless of the threat. You need to have a credible force over time. Then you do not create capability even in this asymmetric warfare, because they know it's not worth it. So I think we risk to overreact to the asymmetric part of it. We need to be able to do all the 5 phases and the higher phases together. On the strategic level, it's never about either or, it's the balance of both. And now we have focused too much, too long time on the lower end, I think.
Just to contribute to that, I think you're right if you're analyzing what's going on, and we have to be aware of that. So it's not only about, let's say, physical forces that we have to protect ourselves. We have to be very careful. For example, if you look at cyber warfare, defending against cyber warfare is not only military. That's why I mentioned all agencies. A whole society has to be prepared to defend themselves and be able to continue operating if somebody attacks you in that way. And if you are also there capable of defending yourself and the others know it, it makes it harder for them to use this asymmetric warfare.
Mika, did you want to add anything to?
Yes. There was a lot of mentioned subject, including doctrine, including readiness category, and so on. I would like to underline the importance of exercise. If you provide an exercise, just after that it's easy to assess the threat, easy to discuss, and easy to protect. If you would like to prepare for asymmetric warfare, and you would like to provide any advantages for asymmetric warfare, just after that it's necessary to provide exercise. It's the best opportunity to recognize your possibility to protect your country, to protect, for example, Poland, Europe, and the other countries, and to recognize the weaknesses which are easy to recognize after the exercise, after evaluation of this exercise. Very important is a readiness category of forces, because many years we decreased number, for example, Poland, we decreased number of troops, yes. Just after that we provide forces of a lower readiness. But if you would like to react, if you would like to be familiarized with a threat, it's necessary to increase the readiness category and to be ready to do your job, military job, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, just to double tap what Jaroslaw just said, the exercise construct, Captain, is exactly, in fact, in Trident Javelin on my cartoon there in the top left-hand corner, we're going to put a corps in the Baltics to address this asymmetric hybrid threat. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the boss, General Scaparrotti, is leaning towards the blocking and tackling, major joint operational maneuver, all the things that the gentleman talked about, long-range precision fires, intelligence. That's where he's leaning towards. That's where he's pushing NATO to. It's not an either-or sort of construct, a hybrid or this. I think it's part of the continuum, as was mentioned, and so that's a part of that exercise design we're going to do.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Brian Love. I'm a student at the U.S. Army War College. Question for all of you today concerns intel sharing, and asking you specifically, what are the major roadblocks that is stopping that? More importantly, what in the environment needs to change, whether it be culture, bureaucracy, coming out of Stockholm, Warsaw, or Amsterdam? What needs to change in order to enable us to better have situational understanding and having probably, hopefully, more than just 7 days of understanding before something major occurs? And please let me sit down because I'm going to take notes.
Well, I'm glad that you brought this up, because it is something that has bedeviled me for at least the last 3 years. And actually, even when I was in Afghanistan, in Kandahar in 2009, 2010, I was under first a Dutch commander and then a British commander in RC South. And we had a mismatch in policy where during the so-called Obama surge, 30,000 more American troops come into Afghanistan. Almost all of them came to RC South, so our president had decided to put all these Americans under first a Dutch commander and then a British commander. But yet, neither of them were allowed to have SIPR. So they couldn't do a Tamberg with any of their American brigade commanders or implement the policy. Now, that wasn't because people were ignorant or stupid or something. It was just different mindsets about how we do this. And I remember after Dr. Clapper came in and he learned about this, he said, this is ridiculous, let's fix that. It still took about 90 days before a sergeant came in with the right kind of cable and plugged it into General Carter's Tamberg so he could talk to all his 30,000 Americans. So I think the point is that our default setting is to protect information versus always writing to release, the default setting being sharing information and sharing intelligence. I think you have the same challenge with Patriot, best missile defense system there is. Germans have it, Dutch have it, Greeks have it, Spaniards have it, as well as the U.S. But it took almost an act of Congress to allow Dutch and German Patriot crew members to climb up into the back of the truck of an American Patriot. And I think part of this is because proprietary, trying to protect things like that, not some national secret. I remember we had American soldiers under or training with Estonians at company level training. I thought, finally, this is great. Everybody's got Harris radio, and they'll be able to talk to each other. Then I realized that the export Harris, of course, has completely different crypto from what the Americans are carrying. So the point is, our default setting is to protect information versus enable communications, enable things that are going to be happening at the tactical level so quickly that even if it was intercepted or even if it was detected, it's not something that an enemy could act on. So number one is recognizing that we are going to be in a multinational environment all the time, and then pounding away on intelligence analysts to make sure when they write it so that it can be released to everybody versus something that has to be double locked up in a vault somewhere.
So I would like to start with an example that we used when we were trying to shape the NATO summit in order to have a closer relationship as partners together with Finland to the NATO. Then I used the example of the Operation Unified Protector, where for a while the Swedish JAS Gripen fighters provided 30% of the intel for the targeting of NATO. And that information was interpreted and delivered on the ground before our fighters landed, because we have a good system. But it was not released to Sweden, because we're not members of NATO. So you can be trusted that your system works. And by the way, we have not formally have the lessons learned yet either. So, so the system works. But it's a great example, because in the end we fixed it, of course, through smaller circles of trust, because we have always operated together with our neighbors, Norway and Denmark, that are members of NATO. And we have the same protocol and the same procedures, so they knew that we, or maybe it was somebody else, could handle the information, because if we are to operate, we need the tactical orders, the spins and so forth. We cannot just fly up and do it in principle. So they needed that information, and it was handled by a guy on a bicycle and a USB. And then it worked. But that's not how it's supposed to be. So we need to address this structural trust, and I think one good example of that is the Federated Mission Network approach to information sharing. I think we need to have differential levels of how to share information. And if you are in the lower level, you would like to know, how do I get to the higher levels? And the answer is by doing this and that and achieve the status of being in the group of Five Eyes that will expand in the future, for instance. And the Bold Quest series addressing that in the right way, I think. So it's in many hands, but in the end it's about trust and operational needs in combination.
Yeah, I very much agree with what is said already, and if you then add to that if you have that information, you have to spread it fast. You need to overcome all the national crypto that we have in place that prevents it from spreading it fast enough at the moment. So we have to find this. If you really want to have information, use that in digital fires and shorten the sensor to shooter loop. If you have, for example, have a Polish sensor and a Dutch shooter, and you want to close that gap, we have to overcome the national crypto issues that we have right now.
I would like to add that very important is in this area recognize where the key challenges would lie, because if you know what's going on just after that, it's easy to react. We are in a very good position, and thanks for that, because now in Poland we have EFP and ABCT, but in a previous time we spent a lot of time with our German colleagues to provide exercise and try to exchange such kind of information. So this is very important to prepare to do it. So for a future, let me say, if you discuss about environment, very important is preparation of a mission and common understanding. Thank you.
Next question.
Rebecca Koffler, Doctrine and Strategy Consulting. First of all, thank you very much for your service, General Hodges, and the entire panel in this important theater of operations, the European theater. Given that the Russian doctrine was in development, at least for the last decades, and they were quite vocal about it, and we had indications and warnings in terms of weapon system development exercises, do you feel that whatever threat forecasting methodology we use was adequate enough? And was it just a resource issue that contributed to our reactive posture rather than proactive? Or is it time to develop a new threat forecasting methodology that would look at over-the-horizon threats? And is there anything that the private sector could do to assist in developing this methodology? And then also the second question, if I may, specifically to General Hodges, you mentioned that the world still needs Russia to come back into international community. You also mentioned that they don't operate based on the same Western logic, and I totally agree with that because my expertise is in Russian doctrine strategy and Russian cyber threat. Do you think these two are reconcilable? Do you think it's feasible for us to cooperate with them? And if yes, what would be those areas of that we can capitalize on cooperating with them without really sacrificing our own strategic advantages and compromising ourselves? Thank you very much.
Okay, so how about we tackle the first big question with the panelists, and then we can have General Hodges take the last question. General Beulen?
If you talk about a new threat methodology, then you have to think about what are you going to measure? Because the same as we say our deterrence depending on the capabilities and we show the will to use it. If you look at the other side, it's about capabilities and the intent to use it. And capabilities is not too hard to measure, but the intent is much harder. And intent can change overnight, like where capabilities can't. So whether you need a new threat methodology, I'm not too sure. It's really the key to find out how can we get behind the intent of a possible adversary.
General Engelbrektson?
That's in combination, I would say, with, because sometimes I think we spend too much time on understanding what he is up to or what Russia is up to. And as you said, we will not get into that type of OODA loop thinking because we are not trained that way, because we don't want to be trained that way. But while accepting that, I think we should put more effort in to define what we would like to do ourselves. Because that thought we master if we want to. But then we have to make up our own mind together in what we would like to achieve, and then do that, and then they will be reactive. I think we have reacted too long, and I think now we have good guidance on the military level from you, Ben, and from Scaparotti, what NATO is up to, and I'm sure that nations will follow, and then we are making our minds up, and then they have to rethink what they are up to.
General Mika, did you want to?
Yes, I would like to underline very importantly such kind of a thing like a discussion, because you ask about methodology. Methodology, if you discuss about some kind of a method, just after that it's easy to prepare a methodology. I give you an example. For example, when the first part of ABCT troops were dislocated in Poland, we spent a lot of time for a discussion of a place, discussion what they are doing, discussion of plans and future challenges. Yeah. And just after that, methodology which you create must be suitable to current circumstances. It is very difficult to predict anything. The best way, it was underlined many times by my colleague, Aurora exercise and Dragon exercise, which was exactly the same time. It was a methodology to protect, to avoid, and to provide a deterrence against Russia. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts about that. I think the templates that were required are not just, Ben talked about when he was a lieutenant, those linear formations that would be walked into that we all fought against. And as an artilleryman, I was going to try to kill these very regimented formations. I think now the sensitivity analysis on whatever template that we would develop from industry would have to penetrate also other domains like cyber and others, not just the ground. The plans that we currently have in NATO to fight are discrete and specific plans. The way the boss is going to now is a theater-wide approach and try to stitch all of them together, because Putin could fix here electronically, penetrate here. If you fight across the breadth and width of NATO, Vice just looking for him coming through the Suwalki Gap and nowhere else, which is how we're going to fight in Trident Javelin here in a month from now. We're going to fight conventionally. It's a Skull-Kent scenario. All of us are all very aware of it. If you're in NATO, many others may know about it. Exercise scenario where near-peer adversary would come over through Norway down and fight that way. But we're also looking to fight, as was mentioned by the captain earlier, the hybrid piece in the Baltics. So my point to all that is, whatever threat model templates we have, they have to be able to do more than just a linear fossil fuel kind of fight. Have to be predictive in these other domains as well. How do we know if we're not at war right now in these other domains? And the fight is some limited scenario penetration is coming. What we're expecting to see, the indications and warnings associated with other domains, I would offer is where you should go.
I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that we absolutely want to keep the door open with Russia. Nobody wants to get into any kind of a kinetic type conflict with them, and I absolutely believe it is possible to have a very strong deterrent posture and to cooperate with them. We did it for the entire Cold War. I mean, we had hundreds of thousands of soldiers facing each other, nuclear weapons, I mean, big formations, and yet we still played hockey. You know, we still had trade, you had cultural exchanges, all those things happened. So it is possible. The areas where I think there's good potential for cooperation, I think Russia has a bigger challenge with Islamic extremism than we do. They have millions of their population in the Caucasus region that are a constant threat throughout Russia for them. So I think this is an area where clearly we can cooperate. I think the Arctic is an area where we're going to have to cooperate. You have several different countries making claims to underwater territory there, and as the with climate change and the increased navigation across the top of the world, I think this is the area where we're going to have to cooperate. Human trafficking, drug trafficking, you know, Russia, a lot of that passes right through Russia, so it's a huge problem for them. This is an area where we can cooperate. And right now, today, imagine a blockade that had Chinese and Russian Navy ships along with American ships around North Korea, or some other way to achieve pressure on North Korea that included the Russians as well as other countries. These are all areas where I think you could really achieve some sort of cooperation.
So I think we have time for one more question. If we have someone who has one more question.
Yeah.
Generals, I'm Brigadier General Pekka Toveri. I'm the Finnish Defense Attaché here in DC. 2014 was a great wake-up for us all because Russia started to misbehave. If Mr. Putin would have waited another 5 years, we all would have been in coma. We were getting rid of last of our national defense capabilities, and last American troops would have left, and the last guy would have, you know, shut down the lights. One fear I have personally, and knowing how good the Russians are in this game, strategic game, that they start to behave. And how we keep, you know, I think the Russians were greatly surprised on how strongly West answered to this threat, and they see that the deterrence is there already. So what if they start to behave for the next 5 years? How do we keep up this deterrence, knowing that average politicians have quite a short memory span, and they don't necessarily want to pay all this deterrence which we are creating, which is very costly?
Joe, any question? You want to take that one first? Or?
I want to try to give you an answer. I think the best way is to expand the interest and the knowledge of the politicians a little bit. And you see that developing, at least in the countries around us, is that defense budgets are now made not for the next year, but for the next 6, 7, or 8 years. And if you could really study what you did since 2011, because you had major budget cuts, it took a lot of energy out of the force. There was a lot of destroying of capital. As we all know, also with budget cuts, the costs go before the benefits. So in the last 6 years, I think we took all the cost, but we'll never get the benefits because we're going to build up again. And if we really register that quite well, discuss it, I see a tendency now that also our politicians get smarter and have developments for the long haul and not for the next 2 years.
I actually think that venues like this and people like us, we can help a bit if we start to take land power serious, like it is in the title of today's seminar. I think we have too quickly given up facts. It hasn't changed that much. Of course, a brigade today includes more modern warfare, more technology, longer distances, But in the end, it's about combined arms and being able to move units with all the assets from one place to another. How should we otherwise be able to help each other if we cannot bring assets that makes a difference? And when you break it down really, if we want to be strong and interoperable, in the end it's about well-trained brigade combat teams, if we want to make a difference, if it's an existential threat. And that story I think we can reinforce each other with, if you agree with that story. Because we need to be able, especially in my country where we have, and it's the same in Norway and Denmark, because we have the law of Jante. It means that you are not allowed to tell yourself what you need. Somebody else needs to help you telling what you should do. And then, of course, again, it's back to leadership. And the great powers and the bigger nations need actually to set the directions for smaller countries to follow and to be able to participate in. And that story we can tell. And in the end, real deterrence and real hope is, of course, about land power, because that's where we live. Land is even the home for the Air Force and the Navy.
That question.
That question, yeah?
Did you
I'm a typical tanky, so you speak loudly a little. Okay. Coming back to this strategic game, from a military point of view, because it was mentioned not only, but it was underlined the policy and what we should do it. From a military point of view, it's very easy. Like a civilian, if you are strong, you build your fitness. Yes. Just after that, it's nobody touch you. So just after that, defense policy is very important. If you provide appropriate level of a defense policy and you suit it to a policy against, and you provide more advantages for a military is better. Very important is possesses of new capability, new ability to react anytime, to react very fast. But the first, what I underline is this matter is a technical modernization, not to wait, but to provide more capability. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think that was our last question, but what I'd like to do is offer each of the panelists some closing comments if they'd like to do so. We can start at the end with General Williams, and we'll work our way down. Sorry to put you on the spot there, sir.
It's okay. I'll just end with double tapping what was already said. I think the way we get to it, General, is a consistent and compelling message repeated over with relentless pressure to the nations. The strength of NATO, the strength of the armies of the nations is our teamwork and our diversity. And so I think it's this consistent, compelling, I know that's where my boss, General Scaparrotti, spends most of his time, making that compelling argument about the strength of NATO. And in that, you build resilience over time, not only national resilience, but NATO resilience. And that's, I think, the message for the politicians long term. Thanks.
General Mika, any closing comments at the end of the panel?
Yes, I would like to underline and what I would like to say once again, thank you for all partners, for all nations which cooperate with Poland, especially for lesson learned which is provided by my colleague. We are together now and we know each other. This is a very important cooperation. It was mentioned today during a breakfast, 3 ships. They are very important. Thank you very much.
General Beulen?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's the lessons I take away and the messages we take away is we always have to do this together. We have to focus on high-intensity conflict and bring the capabilities and the knowledge back again, and we are on the way to do that. And we have to use the means we get fast and carefully.
General Engelbrektson?
I think if we keep up the tempo with having bigger and high complexity in our exercises, we will be able to drive development as well. But we need to do it.
So, 3 final points. First of all, I think you've seen incredibly talented officers, allies, and friends, and hopefully you've also picked up the level of engagement and involvement and activity by armed forces in Europe. My fear is that the perception from the States is that it's only the U.S. Army or only the U.S. is doing anything and everybody else is just on the sidelines or in the bleachers. But clearly that's not the case. The United States actually is a very, very small portion of the deterrence efforts that are going on in Europe, and all of our allies are stepping up, not just in spending, but in what they're doing, their activities, leadership. I mentioned German leadership earlier. I'll emphasize that again. Now, on the back of our placemat, by the way, you'll notice there's a sheet that says NATO contribution recommendations, our top asks. Rather than just saying, hey, you got to spend your 2%, those are things that we need. Help with transportation, for example, things that would help the alliance, infrastructure improvements. These are other ways that allies can invest in collective security. But I really wanted to highlight the fact that our allies are doing so much more than I think is really understood and appreciated here in the States. The second point is that our top needs, if you will, in terms of capabilities, we've been pretty consistent here over the last couple of years. Those same capabilities remain. Number one, aviation. Nobody takes us serious unless nobody takes the Army serious unless you've got Army aviation as a part of it. So whether it's rotational aviation brigade or forward station, without aviation, we're not a credible deterrent force. So that will always be at the top of my list for things that I need. Number two, and you heard the Chief talk about it today, it's a priority for the entire Army, long-range precision fires. Right now we have a real challenge in terms of who's got the longer reach, whether it's Russian Federation forces or what we have. So that is always going to be a priority. Number three, missile defense. We have a Patriot Battalion. They're exceptional. There's no Patriot Battalion in the Army that is as capable as 5788. We send those young guys, men and women, all over the place. We had one battery deployed all the way to Sweden by themselves, led by their battery commander, to participate in Aurora. At the same time, another battery headed off to northern Germany to protect the port of Bremerhaven as part of an exercise. This is routine, moving hundreds of kilometers by themselves. It's one battalion, and it's going straight to Ramstein if there ever is going to be a crisis. So improving our missile defense capability has got to be a priority. The logistics, now that I'm an old person, all I care about is logistics. General Shapiro, General Gamble, Michelle Donahue, they hate that actually now that I care so much about logistics, but without logistics, none of the other stuff matters. Transportation, supply, maintenance, all these things are so important for us. The only unit that everybody in Europe knows by name is 21st Theater Sustainment Command because they support everybody. Division headquarters and a corps headquarters. That's what I need, that echelon of command. There's a reason you have echelons of command. Today it pretty much goes from U.S. Army Europe straight down to the brigade level or in some cases battalion level. It's not the most effective means, but we've had to sort of back into it because of decisions that were made over time, all decisions that made sense at the time, but we've ended up with a command and control structure that may not be the most ideal. The Army's trying to help us by giving a mission command element, a 95-man division tactical command post, basically, which is in Poznan, Poland, and they run everything that happens from Estonia to Bulgaria. I would love to have a full-up division headquarters and a corps headquarters because we are also responsible for being, in addition to the Title 10 Army Service Component Command, we also are responsible for being the Joint Force Land Component Command under UCOM. So we're not manned to do even one of those fully, and now to do both of them obviously is a little bit of a stretch. All of those things are a higher priority than getting another brigade. And the argument always seems to go, hey, do you want a rotational armor brigade, or wouldn't you rather have an armored cavalry regiment instead of a striker regiment? Those are all irrelevant if we don't have the other pieces that I mentioned first, the logistics, the missile defense, the long-range fires, Army aviation. Those are our requirements. And green paint. I'm tired of seeing brown tanks come off of ships. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we end the panel this afternoon, we do have a lost ID card, so I just want to see if Alberto Leff is still in the audience. If he's not, I'll turn it over to AUSA so that we can make sure Alberto gets his ID card. So I just want to say thank you so much to our esteemed group of panelists. That was a great discussion on deterrence and operations in Europe. And thank you so much to the audience here for your questions and the back and forth discourse. We really do appreciate it. And as always, strong Europe. Have a great day.